Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Sorry about the late start this morning. My name is Marie Goetz. I'm a professor here at the Center for Global Affairs. And the topic of today's discussion is, when is sexual violence in conflict a tactic of warfare and a war crime? So what I'm going to do right now is switch to my PowerPoint, if I can. Looks like it's there. Hoping you can see it. I think, Tana, you would tell me if it's not visible. Perhaps you could tell me if you can't see it. Otherwise, I'm assuming you can all see it. Now, this is going to be just a half-hour session, quite efficient time-wise. So before I get started, I want to just contextualize this. Some of you may know, others not, that CGA offers a course on women and peacemaking and peace building. I teach that course, and the course covers a wide range of issues around gender and conflict. Sexual violence is just one feature of the way genders experience conflict differently. Just one, but it is kind of the most high profile, high visibility feature. So this is just a very, very short taste of what's available in that course. Before I continue, I would also like to express a trigger warning. The content of the discussion is very difficult and painful. And if anyone feels that this is more than they can take, then of course, no need to sort of endure it. I will not be using explicit, or in any way explicit details. All right, so sexual violence as a tactic of warfare is something that I imagine you have become aware of in many different contexts. But of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine, there have been many, many reports of sexual violence used to do all kinds of things, to terrorize civilians, to torture prisoners, and so on. This article just appeared in November, when quite a lot of this was reported. And in this article, it's reported that there's two major ways in which it's used. It's used to humiliate civilians and terrorize them. And especially there's mass rape in towns, in basements, such as in Bucha early in the war, including detention of people for sustained periods of sexual violence. The second pattern of sexual abuse has been sexual abuse against soldiers, mostly men in detention, which has included allegations of castration. So sexual violence is not just rape, penetration with objects or penises. Sexual violence includes all kinds of things, making people dance naked, sexual humiliation, torture of sexual organs, forced abortion, forced pregnancy. It's a complex crime. And it appears in many conflicts right now. In fact, it is so prevalent and so devastating that a very significant, a major figure in UN peacekeeping, Brigadier General Patrick Cammaert, made this statement at a conference that I ran in 2008 on the subject of sexual violence in war. In fact, he started it with these words: "It is probably more dangerous to be a woman than a soldier in wars today." And that reminds me, I should explain why I know about this topic, quite a lot about it. I used to work for the United Nations at UN Women. I was the head of peace and security there. I was actually the leader of an effort in 2008 to persuade the UN Security Council that it needed to do a lot more on sexual violence, that it needed to address it as a very serious matter of warfare and a very important element of long-term peace building. And in fact, I was involved in drafting Resolution 1820, which was the first UN Security Council resolution expressing its intention to address this problem. Now, part of the challenge at the time in moving from an awareness of the problem to saying, what can we do about it, was to recognize the fact that, well, two huge problems. First one was that it isn't spoken about much, it's deeply underreported. And in fact, it was called, in a UNIFEM report in 2002, it was called History's Greatest Silence. Subsequently, a movie was made with this title that you might want to watch, literally History's Greatest Silence, a movie by Lisa Jackson, where she, it's a documentary on mass sexual violence in Congo, in DRC, which illustrates greatly the implications of this crime. So it's considered to be history's greatest silence because we don't really know very much about the extent and the tactics of sexual violence in many past wars prior to maybe the last 20 years. So for instance, it's only emerged relatively recently, the extent of sexual violence in World War II. The rape of German women by Russian and Allied soldiers, the rape of French women by Allied soldiers. We have no idea really of the numbers. Rape in concentration camps in World War II. We don't really know about it because it wasn't prosecuted. It wasn't addressed in the Nuremberg tribunals. It wasn't treated as the serious crime that it is. If you go to NYU's library, BOP's library, you'll find 40-some volumes of proceedings of the Nuremberg trials. And if you look in the index, you won't find a mention of sexual violence or rape. It wasn't addressed. The French prosecutor at the trials said he didn't want to offend the sensibilities of the court by taking witness evidence on this crime. Sorry, a message just flashed on my screen. I'm trusting you can all see this. So the second problem, so the first problem is that it's underreported. We don't know the extent of it or patterns. The second problem is that it is dismissed as a serious issue. And so as late as 2007, in a meeting with UN Security Council ambassadors, I do remember them saying, some of them saying, we can't do anything about sexual violence. Boys will be boys. Now, that's an offensive statement about male sexuality for a start. But it also suggests a paradigm or a mental kind of approach to sexual violence, which sees it as sex and not war. It's seen as an opportunistic random act by rogue soldiers or by boys being boys, and not as actually part of what war is about, which is the use of violence to advance political and military ends. So in the effort to address this issue, we had to, in the campaigns around this in 2007, 2008, we had to address both the paucity of data and the attitude that this is collateral damage. It can't be stopped. It's a random act. It's a force of nature. It's not like cluster bombs and other banned methods of fighting, poisoning wells, bombing schools, bombing hospitals. Those are all seen as illegal means of fighting that can be stopped and can be prosecuted, recruiting children, for example. But sexual violence, it's sex, it's not war. So Jan Egeland at the time was the head of OCHA, the head of humanitarian affairs at the UN, and he conveniently helped to explain the problem. Sexual violence is left to humanitarian agencies to patch up. They offer a rape survivor a blanket and some food. We can document it, we can deal with the victims, but we need to address this, he says, as a political and security issue. So I'm going to explain in my time left what it means to address it as a political and security issue. So the first thing is we have to address this issue about, is this really a random act? Is this really collateral damage? And research into past wars and the use of sexual violence in past wars quickly brings up evidence to prove that it's not random and it's not just about individuals wanting sex. So the oldest war I have here is this picture on the bottom right of Korean comfort women who were being protected in China after the war. So comfort women, it's estimated to be about 200,000 of them were forcibly put into brothels by the Japanese army, not just in Korea, but Indonesia, China, and other places, and forced to provide sex for Japanese soldiers. Well, that implies that is sexual violence, forced sex, right? And that implies an organized, bureaucratized approach, right? It's like it's advanced forethought. That means there's command responsibility. When we're looking to sort of say that anything is a tactic of warfare, and if it's illegal that it can be prosecuted, you got to find somebody to prosecute, a commander. So that's command responsibility. In the upper right is the 1971 Bangladesh War. 250,000 at least women were raped by Pakistani soldiers as part of an effort of miscegenation, which is forced pregnancy, to weaken the ethnic line of the Bengalis. Never properly prosecuted, but there was evidence, including in this woman's testimony, of organized efforts to ensure that soldiers could have access at any time of day or night in their barracks to Bangladeshi Bengali women to rape. Bosnia war crimes, both in Bosnia and the same war, same period, 1994, a war in Rwanda. Both of these wars saw huge amounts of organized rape. In Bosnia, women and men were organized into concentration camps where the purpose was rape and ritual humiliation. Efforts by some doctors to put an end to this on the Serbian side were countered by commanders who said, no, we cannot stop this. It's very effective in humiliating and weakening the enemy. Well, that kind of an exchange becomes proof that this is a tactic of warfare, and it actually could be stopped. And this case down on the bottom left here is a very interesting one, Pauline Nyaramishiko. She is the first high-ranking woman to be charged with conflict-related sexual violence. She was actually the Minister for Gender under the government of Habyarimana, who was killed in the plane crash that triggered the Rwanda war in '94. She ordered her son to organize systematic rape of Tutsi women in the area that she comes from. So a clear example of organized sexual violence. So when we're thinking about the reframing of thinking on sexual violence, the first step is to recognize that it is not random. It can be organized. There can be command responsibility, and it can be systematic. So the one example of Serbia and the rape camps I've just mentioned. Another example is Yazidi women, only a few years ago, who were surrounded on Mount Sinjar by ISIS troops. Some efforts to rescue the Yazidi people from the top of the mountain by helicopter, but many women were rounded up by the ISIS fighters, and they were put into buses that had been specially brought to the combat area with curtains in the windows, and brought to sex sort of markets where they were auctioned to soldiers as sex slaves. Of course, there's a very important survivor of that violence, Nadia Murad, who won a Nobel Prize a few years ago for her courage, because she managed to escape this horrific sex slavery. So this is an example of how you can think of sexual violence as a tactic of warfare that is deliberately organized. It is not random. The second conceptual framework is to recognize that it is actually a deliberate means of pursuing political ends. So it's not an aggressive manifestation of sexuality. It's a sexual manifestation of aggression. It's a sexual way of fighting. So as a tactic of warfare, it's highly efficient in terrorizing and humiliating the enemy, altering the ethnic composition of an enemy group, spreading diseases that are debilitating to populations, and it's one of the most effective ways of triggering population flight. It was used by Assad's regime, for example, sexual violence against boys in detention, used to trigger huge outflows of populations, triggering, of course, the 2012 to 2015 refugee wave. And of course, it destroys community cohesion across generations when atrocities linked to sexual violence are forced on relatives. It has long-term economic impacts. It can undermine recovery because the victims, most often women, but of course men are victims too, probably many more than we know. the victims are stigmatized for the crime, not the perpetrator. It is the one war crime where the victims are blamed for the violence. So where you will see statues to people killed in wars, whose legs have been amputated in wars, statues to people who've been traumatized. You won't see statues to people who've been raped because that's considered to be shameful. They're the ones who bear the shame. And when it's women victims, their children also are infected with the shame and ostracized from communities. That breaks up communities. Women's freedom of movement is impaired by the constant post-war threat of sexual violence, which means women can't go farming, they can't engage in market activities. That affects economic recovery, therefore it deepens post-conflict poverty. And this humiliation builds resentment and the desire for revenge, which can lead to a return of cycles of violence. There are also governance legacies of sexual violence. It can undermine both men and women's credibility if they're victims as sexual leaders. They've been raped, they're seen as ruined, not having credibility. And impunity for the perpetrators, the fact that perpetrators don't come to justice, makes a mockery of the effort to reassert the rule of law after conflict. After all, that is what peace building is all about, is reasserting the rule of law instead of the rule of the gun. So here's just an example of how sexual violence was used exclusively as a war tactic in 2010. In that little spot on the map with the red dot, in a period of 4 days, almost 400 civilians, men and women, and babies, children, were raped and subjected to other forms of sexual violence over 3 days by a group called the Mai Mai Cheka in this tiny area in Walikali, DRC. Now, there was not a single murder. There was not a single amputation. It was only sexual violence. It had the desired effect of triggering a population evacuation and leaving behind what the rebels wanted, which was unobstructed access to the gold mines, which of course the rebels used to fund their insurgency. So that is a clear example of the tactical use of sexual violence. So I am going to just help you conceptually to understand when is sexual violence a tactic of war and a war crime. Obviously, not all sexual violence in war is a war crime necessarily, or not all sexual violence advances political and military objectives. So we can see sexual violence on a continuum from widespread, so mass examples like the one I just gave you from Walikali, and isolated, widespread and isolated, the big difference. And we can also distinguish between examples that are systematic, which means organized and planned, like rape camps, and random. So the tactic which most fits into tactic of warfare, and of course, war crime, crime against humanity, is when sexual violence is deployed deliberately to advance military or political objectives on a mass scale. And the strongest case are cases where we can see that it's commanded, that it's organized. And I've given you some examples already. There's also a case to be made for when sexual violence is condoned. So commanders know about it, but don't stop it. Or they encourage soldiers to commit sexual violence as part of the spoils of war. Stalin, for example, in World War II said, "Who am I to stop my soldiers from taking their pleasure with German women?" Now, when it's condoned, that also implies command responsibility, because any commander of a fighting force is aware, or should be aware, of the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war. And the allowing troops to use illegal tactics of war constitutes command responsibility. In West Africa, in Sierra Leone, sexual violence was used in armies that consisted of child recruits, often used as a bonding mechanism to help children who would commit an atrocity together. They would bond and separate from their communities. But that is also use of sexual violence as a war tactic. It advances the military mission. There's other forms of sexual violence which are not widespread, which are maybe even individual or very narrowly targeted. for political objectives. And I've mentioned an example already: torture in detention, sexual torture in detention, which is commanded or condoned. And that we know many cases of this now, of course, in the Ukrainian war, but it was used under the Pinochet regime in Chile. It's used in Belarus. It's used in Chechnya. It is a very, very serious international crime. There are isolated criminal incidents of sexual violence in war and in peacetime, random attacks, unplanned, unlinked to any political motive. Those are domestic criminal matters. They don't come into the definition of tactics of war. And there's another very problematic category, which we're seeing emerging in cases of very large scale, very widespread sexual violence, a very difficult category. And that is when sexual violence has been so normalized in the context of extended wars that it then is adopted or becomes quite regular, quite common. So we see this in Liberia and DRC, where sexual violence is the most significant violent crime. It's not for advancing political or military objectives. It is caused because of state failure. To the degree that it's because of state failure and a failure to prosecute perpetrators, it remains an international crime. Otherwise, it is a very, very serious long-term developmental and social change issue. So the conceptual framing, that the third one that had to be pursued in order to get the world to think differently about sexual violence, was to suggest that there were ways to stop it. Because even if you shift from saying, okay, sexual violence is not about sex, it's about war, what can you do to stop it? A lot of people's minds go blank. There are many things that can be done. So for example, in peacekeeping contexts where there's soldiers on the ground trying to prevent conflict, like in Mali, for instance, or Cyprus or DRC, there are, and actually North and South Sudan, you can have peacekeeping patrols to help women. Here's an example. A picture where women are accompanied by peacekeepers as they go and collect firewood, because that's the, for example, from refugee camps, that's when they're often attacked. Training of soldiers and including female uniformed personnel amongst peacekeeping troops and police, very, very effective in building civilian confidence and in trying to prevent sexual violence. Longer term, of course, justice, ending impunity for perpetrators, much more rapid justice, mobile courts delivering decisions. International tribunals like the ICC has included sexual violence in many important indictments and convictions, including the recently renewed conviction of Bosco Ntaganda, that's him in the upper right-hand corner. And then transitional justice measures, truth-telling, acknowledgement of what happened. So for example, in Sierra Leone, there is an acknowledgement of the extent of sexual violence, a presidential apology, and of course, investment in addressing the needs of victims and providing reparation. Prevention of sexual violence is a long-term project, very difficult, does require law reform, disarmament and arms control, attitudinal change, training of armed forces. And this, of course, is linked to long-term prevention of violent conflict in general. So I am going to, I think, stop there, maybe just with this kind of more forward-looking thought, which is we actually can change things that seem unchangeable, unjust, and perpetual. They're not, nothing is. We can change things. And if you're a student of international relations or want to be one, Keck and Sinkink write a lot about what's called constructivist theory, about how it's not just the great powers who do whatever they want. The world has changed to bring in important legal and political changes. And she says that they say, both of them are women, they say, the way the world changes is through norm entrepreneurs, activists, people like you and me, who prove that a given state of affairs is neither natural or accidental, which is what we proved with regard to sexual violence and conflict. It's not about natural desires for sex. It's not accidental, it's organized, right? A given state of affairs is not natural or accidental, and in fact, we can find who's responsible and we can propose credible solutions. And that is what happened in this case. So thank you very much. And I'll just check to see if there's any questions, and I don't see any. So with that, I think we can end this, because I know that people wanted to end around this time, even though we started late. I'm not seeing any questions, but if you are interested in studying these issues, do feel free to contact me at CGA. Thank you so much.